Hello students, I'm Miss Favor Olarewaju and I'm so excited to be your instructor for this economics class, Econ 2010, aka Introduction to Macroeconomics. You can call me Favor, as in God's favor, or please do me a favor, that kind of favor. Okay, so really easy. I've had a lot of good experience teaching this class and I look forward to having an amazing time with this online class as well. So in this class, over the next few weeks, we're going to be learning a lot of exciting stuff about how any economy works. So conceptual things like inflation, unemployment, even in the job market, right? What influences the decision to work or leisure, what influences like the demand and supply, what is demand and supply, who are the consumers, who are the firms, and what role does government play in the economy. So we're going to be studying how all these different economic units, meaning individuals, household, firms, and the government, and even on the international scale when it comes to trade, we're going to be learning how all of these entities come together to make up any economy, right? So it's going to be an exciting couple of weeks. I'm going to be uploading a lot of resources, videos explaining concepts like I'm doing right now, and also videos explaining how to do certain calculations, right? So like taxation, elasticity, in other words, how do people respond to changes in price or income and all of that stuff. So I'm going to be uploading videos and also additional resources from verified institutions to help your understanding of all these topics you're going to learn. Every week there's going to be assignments. You're going to have 2 assignments every week. The first assignment will be based off on 2 chapters and then just 30 questions, and you're going to have 3 attempts. So that's pretty good attempts to make sure that you really understand and you're learning, right? So it's not just about passing, it's about understanding. I really want you to understand all these concepts, right, even after you take this class. The first assignment for the week is going to be due on Wednesday midnight, and then the second assignment for the week is going to be due on Sunday midnight, okay, 11:59 p.m. So I encourage you, do not wait until the last minute. I'm going to make the videos as explanatory as possible. So once you watch the videos and you read the PowerPoint and any other extra resources that I post, you should be good to answer your questions easily and you have multiple attempts to get it right, okay? So quickly, let's jump into chapter 1. So chapter 1 is just talking about 10 principles of economics, right? So the first major principle, which is the foundation of economics, is scarcity. So first of all, what is economics? Economics is a social science of decisions that individuals and households and entities make, and the whole point is, why are they making these decisions? So it's based off on 2 things. It's based off on limited resources. The resources include things like land, aka like our classrooms are built on land, houses are built on land, and all of that. But land is a scarce resource because when you have a plot of land or you have plots of land, you have to face the tough decision of what are you going to do with the land. You want to make sure you're using it for the best use possible. So there's going to be, which we're going to be learning more about, we're going to be learning scale of preference. So when you have scarce resources like land, there's also capital, right? So capital is, for instance, the laptop you use, the gadgets you use to produce items, right? So like your air fryer, your laptop, your desktops, the furniture in the classroom, right? All of these are capital, infrastructure, and that's also limited because it's costly to produce, and you can't just wake up in the morning and just have a capital infrastructure appear, right? It takes a lot of work to get that going. Another scarce resource is money. So money is very limited. There's only so much we can earn on a daily basis or on a monthly basis, and you've got to make a tough choice of what to do with that money, right? In terms of scaling down your most important needs according to your preferences. And then there's also time. Time is also a scarce resource. So you only have 24 hours in a day and you want to do so many things, right? You want to cook, you want to eat, you want to hang out with friends, you want to go out and relax, you need to work because how else are you going to pay your bills? You want to also have some good sleep. So there's so many things to do in 24 hours. So now that you got so many things to do and so many options, aka unlimited ones, but you have so very limited resources, aka only 24 hours, which is your time, and that is the first principle, scarcity. What do you do? How do you make your decision, which is the second principle, making choices? How do you do this? This leads to the third principle, which is trade-off. So trade-off is you have at least 2 options or more, of unlimited ones to meet, but you got to prioritize, right? So there's something they call scale of preference, where you choose, okay, what is the most important thing to do, and then you rank it up to the least important thing to do, right? So you do a trade-off. So for instance, okay, I'm just going to text my mom and, say, how you doing, as opposed to calling her. That's a scale of preference, right? That's prioritizing. And then with the other time you have, you go to work or you choose to study, right? So that is all scale of preference. So that is the third principle, called trade-off. In the process of doing a trade-off, there is something called opportunity cost, meaning what are you giving up to prioritize those important needs of yours, right? So what are you giving up? So you're giving up spending 1 hour on the phone, talking to friends, and, spending 2 hours just going out to party. You are giving all of that satisfaction up, all of that enjoyment, because you want to invest in your time, you want to sacrifice, you want to study, you want to go to work, you want to pay your bills, right? So that all of that is the opportunity cost. Opportunity cost is a combination of what we call implicit cost. Implicit costs are things that you cannot see, that you cannot value, like they're not tangible things that you can value. So for instance, the time you spend at the gas station to get a cheaper gas, your time is going. That money you're spending on the queue, you could have used 1 hour of that to work and get paid, right? So that is an implicit cost. And another component of opportunity cost is explicit cost. So explicit costs are the costs that you can value. So for instance, you're a student, you're enrolled in this course. What are you giving up to be in this class? You are giving up hanging out with friends. You are giving up some extra money you could have made on the job, right? You're paying tuition. Tuition is your explicit cost, right? The salary that you're forgoing on the job is an explicit cost as well, right? So that is part of your opportunity cost. The time that you're giving up instead of being in bed, sleeping extra, playing video games, that is your implicit cost. So all of these implicit costs and explicit costs adds up to your opportunity cost, which is what you are giving up in order to have a trade-off and choose the most important needs, to make a choice. And now this brings us to the fourth principle, and the fourth principle is called efficiency. So efficiency just means with the very limited resources you have, you want to make the most of that limited resources. So for instance, you have $10, right? But you want to put that $10 to the best use possible, right? You want to get the most valuable thing that is going to last you for the longest time. That is being efficient, right? And being efficient is different from equality. So equality is like everybody gets an equal piece of the pie, right? But as we know in life, no one is equal, right? So even your 5 fingers are not equal. So usually when government makes policies, so for instance, we all were affected by the COVID pandemic. Government gave some financial incentives to help since people couldn't work as usual, right? But now as government is giving financial incentive, there is a trade-off between efficiency and equality, right? So efficiency in terms of, the money that government is giving is helping to cushion some financial needs and bills, for those that are not able to work as much. But how about equality? That doesn't mean everyone is earning the same income, right? No one is earning the same income, everybody's getting different proportions of income. How about even tax? Tax, no one pays the same, the percentage is the same, but the amount of the tax is different for everybody, right? Based on your income tax or based on your sales tax. So that is just a trade-off. So whenever government makes policies, it's a trade-off between being efficient and being equal. So if a policy is more efficient, then it's most likely less equal, right? And if a policy is more equal, then it's most likely less efficient. So like for instance, back to the COVID incentive, it kind of bridges the gap, to kind of make things easier for people. So it's tending towards equality, but it's less efficient because it then discourages people from working in the labor market and, being productive. So that is the fourth principle, efficiency versus equality. The fifth principle is something called rationality. In other words, are you a rational consumer? So rational consumers are people who make decisions when the marginal benefit is greater than the marginal cost. What is marginal benefit? Marginal just means extra, okay? So for instance, why am I going to go to the store to buy this marker? Because I know that the benefit for me is way more valuable than the cost. If I buy this marker for $2, of course it's going to be cheaper, but let's just say $2, right? If I'm going to buy this marker for $2, that's the cost, the explicit cost. The implicit cost is me going to the store, right? Now, the benefit of me buying this marker is I get to teach. I can use this marker for like months, right? Teaching on the board to my students, and that helps me to get paid, right? So the benefit is way more than the cost. So that makes me a rational consumer. So an irrational is, IRRAT. So an irrational consumer is someone who just makes decisions not based on benefits outweighing the cost, but makes decisions based on addictions or emotions. So for instance, drug addicts, right, or those who like alcohol, they are not taking it because there's any benefit. They just want to, maybe they just need to relax, cool off, forget their problems, and then they use it, right? So that's based on addiction and emotions as opposed to logical decisions. So that is that about the fifth concept called rationality. The sixth concept is called invisible hand. Invisible hand is something that you cannot see. So it's something in the market where things balance out between demand and supply, right? So for instance, if the price of a product goes up, then what happens? The quantity demanded, the quantity you demand is going to reduce, right? So if I buy this marker for $2 and all of a sudden there's inflation and it's $3, I'm going to reduce the number of markers I buy, right? It's just logic, right? When the price of something goes up, like I use the marker as an example, the price of the marker goes up, and because of that, I demand for less markers, right? Based on logic and rational decision making. What happens is the producers also want to be able to sell. They don't want to have markers in their storehouses for years, right? They want to be able to sell off and make profits. So even if they have to do like a discount or do a promotion at a certain time to get to sell off all that is left in the storehouse or in the warehouse, they would do that, right? So in this way, the invisible hand works so that the consumers and the producers find a middle ground, in the adjusting their decisions, their prices, right, by doing discounts or adjusting their demand or supply based on what is going on in the markets, right? So that is how the demand and supply works based off on market's invisible hand. And this concept was developed by Adam Smith, who is one of the four founders of economics. Okay, and now the next concept to explain, the seventh concept, is called government intervention. So as you remember, during COVID, most of us couldn't work, all of us were stuck at home trying to stay safe, isolate, and not get infected with the coronavirus. So what that meant is that a lot of businesses had to fall down. People were short of money because they weren't working to get money, and so it was tough for a lot of people. So what did the government do? The government intervened by giving what we call fiscal stimulus, right? So the government gave money to people that were eligible to get money, right? A lot of people actually, to help them financially so that they could still go on with their daily lives. So that is one example of government intervention. Another example of government intervention, which we're going to be learning in detail in this course, is something called price floor and a price ceiling. So a price floor is the legal minimum price that the government imposes to make sure that people are not extorted. So a good example of that would be minimum wage. The government wants to make sure that we're well compensated for our labor, so therefore employers cannot pay below a certain minimum wage, right? So that's an example of a price floor. We're going to learn all of this, but a price floor, when you're plotting the graph, because it's a price floor, meaning that you cannot go below that amount, you can pay anywhere above that amount. So a price floor is going to be up there above the equilibrium price, right? So that is how it works. Another, the opposite of a price floor would be a price ceiling. A price ceiling is the legal maximum price that the government imposes in order to make sure that, again, people are not being extorted. But a good example of that would be rent control, right? So you know how landlords can be, if they have their way, they want to charge so much rent, but then the government says, okay, you cannot charge above a particular rent, right? So meaning that you can charge anywhere below that rent, but you cannot charge above that rent. So because of that concept, so the price is going to be below the equilibrium price, right? So these are ways that government intervenes when the market doesn't automatically adjust based on invisible hand, right? And also there's also something called externality. So externality is when, for instance, when factories are producing, they release lots of waste into the environment, smoke pollution, noise pollution, all of that. So because of that, the government intervenes by fining them to pay a certain tax that is going to use to clean up the environment, right? So I don't know if you've heard of the global financial crisis, which happened in 2007. So basically, that was a situation where there was crisis in the housing market, and that affected a lot of other economies and caused a global recession, right? So when there's a crisis like that, the government has to intervene. And ninth principle of economics is something called living standards. So basically, in the US, the standard of living is very different from Europe, right? So for instance, medical care is more expensive in the US compared to Europe, and the tax system in the US is way cheaper compared to Europe. So different living standards just means how much is $1 worth in Europe, for instance. In terms of living standard, the pound has more value than the dollar. So based on that, what a pound can buy in Europe, for instance, is different from what the dollar can buy in the US, right? So that is that on living standard. Inflation. What is inflation? Inflation is when there's a general increase in price. And this is the ninth concept, inflation, when there's a general increase in the prices of all the goods and services. So if the price of only marker increases, that is not inflation. But if the price of marker, groceries, electronics, everything in the market, all the goods and services in the market increases, then that is called an inflation. And when there's inflation, it just means that there's too much money that is chasing too few goods. So usually when there's inflation, there's less production and there's just excess money flowing in the country. And because of that, then the money loses its value. And that is what leads to loss of purchasing power. So you need to spend way more and get way less, right? Purchase way less goods in the market. Trade-off is the 10th principle. Another example of trade-off is inflation and unemployment. So these have a negative relationship, so they go in opposite directions. So when, for instance, unemployment is high, that means the people that are employed are relatively low, and that puts a downward pressure on prices and inflation. So because there is few employed people and high unemployed people, then the workers have less bargaining power. And as a result of that high unemployment, workers and companies are most likely going to keep wages the same or try to cut down on wages. And then the opposite applies. So when unemployment is low, meaning that there's high employment going on, then there's more competition in terms of higher, companies competing to pay higher competitive wages, because then the employment is high and the unemployment is low. So that's a good example, another example of a trade-off. And that wraps up chapter 1. So moving on to chapter 2, how do you think like an economist? So there's something called the circular flow diagram. First of all, economics is based off on theories. It uses existing data to formulate theories and predict people's behaviors, right? So theory is an abstraction of reality, right? So for instance, there's something called a circular flow diagram, which just assumes that there are two entities in any country, the individuals and the firms, and then how do resources flow between the households and the firms, right? So for instance, we are, working in the job market, we are supplying our labor in the job market, and what that means is when we go to work, we get paid. So we are labor suppliers in the job market, and then we go to work, we get paid by our employers who are the ones that demand for labor. So when we get paid our wages or our stipend, what do we do with our wages? We then go to the goods and services market and then purchase goods and services, right, for consumption or for whatever use, right? So in the goods and services market, we are the consumers, but in the job market, we individuals are the suppliers, right, of labor. So we're going to learn more about the circular flow diagram. There's resources uploaded to help with that. Then what is quickly a PPF? A PPF just shows what are the possible combination of goods and services that any country or a specific country could produce. It's not what they should produce per se. It's just like, okay, these are the combinations of things that you could produce, and then it's based on the country to make their choice, right? So for instance, if you want to do computers and you want to do coffee, right? So it's like the country has to make a decision of, okay, if they're going to produce more computers, then they're going to produce less coffee, right? So again, that's another example of a trade-off. And that's pretty much what the PPF is about, right? Production possibility frontier. Then there's something called positive and normative statements. So positive statements are things that are actually facts. So for instance, when you say when the price of a good increases, the quantity demanded of that good reduces, all other things being equal, right? So that is a fact. That's just rational thinking, and that is a positive statement, right? So things like that actually are, right? And then in normative statements are things that should be. So it's based off on opinions and perception. So for instance, when you're saying there should be no minimum wage, that's a perception because it should, or so these are examples. That is how you differentiate between positive statements with the is or the are, or if this happens, then this happens. Those are positive statements. But when you say, oh, this should not be, or this could cause a lot of problem, then that is a normative statement. And yeah, so again, economics uses data, it uses graphs. So graphs are just like pictorial representations of what is going on in any event. And it also uses equation. Economics will use equations, which is just, mathematical modeling of things that are going on in the economy. And that's pretty much all for chapter 2. Thank you. Hi again. So I'm going to be covering chapter 3 real quickly. Chapter 3 is based off on interdependence and trade gains, right? So what is the basis for trading? Why do countries trade with one another? The major basis for trade is something called comparative advantage. Comparative advantage. So that simply is based off on opportunity cost. So remember we talked about opportunity cost, which is what do you have to give up in order to get your most important wants or needs, right? So for instance, in terms of trade, it's saying, okay, if you want to produce between potatoes and meat, for instance, right? What production of a good do you have to give up less for? So if you want to produce meat and you have to give up a lot more resources, then that is a higher opportunity cost and you're better off producing potatoes, right? So comparative advantage is the basis for trade. And how does a country have comparative advantage? By choosing to produce a good in which they have to give up the least amount of resources for, right? Now, this is very different for something called absolute advantage. Absolute advantage is simply you can produce it in the less amount of time, right? But that doesn't necessarily mean you're giving up the least amount of resources, right? So comparative advantage is the basis for trade. That's something I want you guys to always remember. And now there's something called allocative efficiency. So we talked about the invisible hand which goes on in the market. So that means demand and supply automatically adjust in the market without the government having to do anything, right? So that is based off on allocative efficiency. Now there's something called productive efficiency, which is based off on comparative advantage, which is what you need for international trade. Okay, so another explanation about comparative advantage is, so let's go back to the coffee and tea example, right? So for United States, as you can infer, it's going to be cheaper for us to produce coffee as opposed to producing tea. So let's say we have two countries, United States and India, right? So United States has a cheaper cost of production for coffee, right? And a higher cost of production for tea, right? So, and then India has a cheaper cost of production for tea. So what is the logical thing to do? Okay, let's specialize in what is cheaper for us, what we have to give up less resources for, right? So US decides to specialize in coffee and India decides to specialize in tea, right? So based off on that, when we enter trade in the international market, the domestic price of producing coffee is cheaper. So then we are going to go into the international trade and sell it at the world price, right? So the world price, we're going to sell it at a higher price because, for instance, India has a higher cost of producing coffee, which is why they're specializing in tea, right? But so because of the very high cost of producing coffee in India, they are willing to buy the coffee from us, right? So that means we can afford to increase the selling price for coffee just a little bit at the international level. So we're going to, save money with producing coffee for a cheaper cost, then go to the international market and sell it at a higher world price. And India and every other country is still going to buy coffee from us because our higher world price is still cheaper than their domestic price of producing it, right, of producing coffee. So that is how comparative advantage works, and that is the basis for international trade. That's basically it for this chapter 3. So don't forget to do your homework too, which is based off on chapter 3. Just 20 questions. Take out 1 hour, sit down, watch the videos and everything, and do your homework. It's due Sunday midnight by 11:59 p.m. right? And then first thing on Monday morning, we're going to have chapter 4 materials uploaded. But you have to finish the previous material before you get access to the next material. All right, best of luck, guys.